Camping, not just in North America, but all across the globe, is a very popular way for people to just leave their everyday life behind, go enjoy time in nature. And every year, thousands of people venture off deep into the wilderness to go backcountry camping. And every so often on these trips, they have truly terrifying and unexplained experiences. And today, I'm going to share with you two stories that depict exactly that. But before we get into today's encounters, if you've had an encounter with anything that you would like to have shared on the show, please email me at the link below. If you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And the next time you're off in the backwoods and you're setting up your warning system around camp, don't forget to strap that subscribe button to a tree so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounters. Ryan was just a regular guy in his 20s living out in western Wyoming. He grew up spending a lot of time out in the bush, and all through high school, him and his friends, their favorite pastime was going off into the high country, going camping, practicing bushcraft. It was something Ryan really enjoyed doing, and it was something he did quite often. Ryan was going through a very rough point of his life at this time. He had multiple deaths in the family in fairly rapid succession, and he was looking for a way just to escape life for a few days, leave his troubles behind, reconnect with himself. So he decided he would go solo camping up to a spot where him and his friends had been many times before. He had never been there by himself, but he was very confident in his skills, and he really wanted to test everything that he had practiced all through high school with his friends, his survival skills, his bushcraft skills. So that's what he decided to do. He was going to go to this place out by Dubois, Wyoming, up in the high country. He would spend a couple of days by himself, and then a friend of his would meet up with him after, and they would spend a few more days together. So Ryan packed up all of his gear. He brought everything with him that he thought he would need. He had plenty of water, he had dried food, he had a fire starter, he had an axe, his knife, and also his 357 Magnum. He loaded everything into his packs, loaded it into his car, and then he made the drive out to this location. When he got there, he was forced to park his car in this meadow at the base of the mountains because he did not have a 4x4. He would not be able to drive all the way up to where he would set up camp. So he pulled his car over to the side, got out, grabbed all of his gear, and then he made the trip up into the mountains. Now, this was not a short hike. It was about 5 miles or 8 kilometers, and it was at an elevation of about 9,000 feet. So it took him a couple of hours just to get up to where he would set up camp. Once he got there, he dropped his kit, went through it, set up camp. Then he spent the rest of the day just hanging around camp and preparing for his camp out. That evening, after he had dinner, before he made his way into his tent for the night, he took his food bag, he hung it high up in a tree just to keep the bears away. Then he made his way into his tent, did one last double check just to make sure he had everything he needed for the night, which was his knife, his axe, and his 357, just his basic personal protection. Once he noticed that he had these items inside the tent, he crawled into his sleeping bag and he settled in and eventually drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, though, he was quickly awoken by the sound of heavy thuds coming from all around the outskirts of his camp. He lay there, eyes wide, listening to these thuds, trying to identify what was making them, trying to figure out if this was an animal, if this was a person, trying to see if he could identify it by the sound of the footfalls. He was lying there, and knowing that he's completely alone and he's absolutely terrified because he has no idea what's outside of his tent, he starts reaching over for his 357 when all of a sudden there's this loud thud right beside his tent, and he could feel something right up against the side of it. Then it was like whatever was outside the tent, it was like it took its arm or part of its body and it reached over him like it was spooning him. He lay there completely terrified, not wanting to move. He didn't even want to blink. He thought even if he blinked that whatever was outside the tent would hear his eyes moving. He lay there just terrified and eventually ended up passing out, whether it was just from exhaustion from the hike or from being terrified. But he eventually ended up passing out. When he woke up in the morning, whatever was outside of his tent was gone. He did not feel it anymore. So he slowly got out of his tent, looked around, went and looked at the ground right beside his tent where this thing had been, and all the grass and everything for about 8 feet by 4 feet was just completely matted down. None of this made sense to him. He figured if that would have been a bear outside the tent, that his tent for sure would have been damaged, that his food would have most likely been gone, but everything was intact, his food was still there. So it really made no sense to him. All he could really manage to piece together that made sense to him at the time was that where his tent was and his fire pit, this thing lied directly between him and the fire, and it was really cold that night. So he figured that whatever this was cold, and it was trying to share his body heat, share the heat from the embers of the fire. He decided at this point that he was not going to leave, even though the night before he was more terrified than he had ever been in his life. And shortly later that day, his buddy showed up. His buddy showed up a day early. They spent a couple more days out at this camp, and nothing else like this or no other strange things happened for the remainder of their time there. In the late 90s, Yosef was 32 years old. He was living up in northwestern Russia, right at the base of the Ural Mountains, just northwest of the city of Sarapol. He grew up in this area, and every fall he would head up into the mountains for a few weeks to go hunting and trapping sable. It was something that he grew up doing, something that his father had grown up doing, his grandfather had grown up doing, and it was a way that they can make some extra money for the family to help get them through the rest of the year. See, sable are very similar to martens here in North America, and their fur is incredibly sought after in Russian fashion, so their pelts are worth quite a bit of money. So that was the driving force for his family for pretty much generations to head up into the mountains, spend weeks on end hunting and trapping these things. Growing up in this area, Yosef was very well versed in all the different dangers of the Ural Mountains. The Ural Mountains is just an absolutely expansive wilderness. There's very few communities once you actually get into the ranges, and there's a lot of predators in that area. There's brown bears, there's wolverines, there's even the very odd Siberian tiger. Now, this area at one time had a lot of Siberian tigers in it, but over generations they were slowly hunted to almost extinction. However, there are still some that do kick around in these parts. Now, even though he knew all the dangers with the wildlife in the mountains, he was also very well versed in all the other dangers as well. The terrain is incredibly uneven. It's very similar to the Rocky Mountains here in North America, and the weather can pretty much change on a dime, and it could go from being nice and mild to absolutely freezing cold and snowing within the course of hours. Now, every time he would head up into the mountains, again, he would be gone for 2, 3, sometimes even 4 weeks. The sable season starts in October, runs through till the end of November. So it was late fall when he would do these trips. So the weather was always a concern for him. The animals, on the other hand, he was not overly concerned about these just because he had spent so much time out in the wilderness in this area that he felt that he knew all those dangers. When he would set off into the mountains on this trip every year, he would only take one firearm with him, and that was a .22 caliber rifle. He did not want to have the added weight of having a second firearm with him. He already had all of his traps, all of his gear, all of his supplies that he would need for 2, 3, 4 weeks on end. Now, this trip, he would make it completely on foot. He did not have the luxury of being able to use a vehicle or even an ATV to get into where this camp was, because the terrain was just way too steep, way too rocky, and for the majority of it, it was pretty much a trail that his family had created over the years. It was about a 2-day walk from his home to where this camp was that his grandfather had set up years before. So on this particular season, loaded up everything he would need for 3 weeks, 4 weeks into his pack, loaded his packs up onto his back, and started making his way into the Ural Mountains. Again, this would take him 2 days just to get to where his camp was. The hike in went absolutely great. He had no issues whatsoever. He saw a lot of wildlife on the walk in. He saw quite a few brown bears, some herds of elk, and lots of sign of sable. When he got to his camp, he basically had to spend the whole first day just cleaning it out. He had not been there since the year prior, so he had a year's worth of basically nature to clean up after. He had a three-sided lean-to shelter that he would normally sleep in, keep all the supplies in, so he had to clean that out. He had to gather firewood for his fire pit, lay out all of his stuff, set his traps aside so that he could go run his trap lines. The next morning, he woke up, grabbed his traps, went out, laid his trap line, and for the next week and a half, he pretty much had the same schedule. He would get up in the morning, he'd go check his traps, find out if he managed to harvest any sable, take the ones that he did harvest, basically skin them, and then he would have to hang the hides up in a tree. So he had this system rigged up between these two spruce trees. It was a big chain system. He used chain because he feared that if he used a rope, predators such as the wolverines would be able to climb up the tree, gnaw on the rope, and then his hides would all fall to the ground. And then basically all the work he had done would have been for nothing. To get to the chain, which was 16 feet up in the trees, he had built a ladder out of beams from a tree that he had cut down, and he would take that ladder, put it up against the tree, climb up, grab that chain, hang a pelt, pull it over, hang another pelt, and so on. And on this particular evening, that's exactly what happened. He had got back to camp. It was already dark out. He was completely exhausted from basically 2 weeks being out in the Ural Mountains. Grabbed that ladder, put it up against a tree, climbed up, hung his pelts, came back down, got a fire going for the night, had some food. Then he made his way into that three-sided lead-to. He climbed onto a bed that he had constructed out of basically beams from a tree, as well as a whole bunch of pine boughs to act as a mattress, climbed into his sleeping bag, basically just lied there looking towards the fire. As he's laying there looking towards the fire, he could feel his body starting to relax, and he slowly started to drift off to sleep. Right before he was fully asleep, he all of a sudden heard something very large coming through the woods directly towards camp. Now, this was not a one-off. This was not uncommon. Joseph had animals come up to camp, snoop around camp, pretty much every night, every time he had been there, so he was not really that alarmed at this noise. So instead of sitting up and grabbing his rifle, which really would do nothing if it was a bear, he just opened his eyes, kept looking towards the bush line on the other side of the fire. He thought it was for sure probably an elk, maybe a bear. If it was a bear, he figured he would deal with that once he knew what he was dealing with. So he's lying there looking across the fire towards that bush line when all of a sudden he hears that chain system start to move, and he could hear the chains rattling together. Now, this did startle Joseph because the way that he had this chain system set up, and the reason he had this chain system set up the way he did, was to make it inaccessible to bears. Now, it was not inaccessible to wolverines. The wolverines could easily climb the trees, but the brown bears really could not climb. Joseph at this point is starting to really feel uneasy because he knew that there's no way that that was a bear messing with that chain, and whatever had been moving towards his camp was definitely not a wolverine. It was way too heavy, way too large. At this point, he's even more laser focused, looking directly across a fire towards that chain, and he could see the faint outline of it right up against the tree line, and he could see that it's moving. Now, it wasn't moving left and right as if somebody or something was pulling on it. It was moving closer to him and then further away, like something was pulling and rocking on this thing. At this point, he reached over, grabbed his .22, fired a shot into the air. As soon as he did that, he heard this loud, guttural snarl-like growl come from that direction, immediately followed by the sound of that chain just completely snapping. As soon as the chain snapped, he could hear something incredibly large basically running through the trees away from his camp. At this point now, Joseph is completely terrified. He has no idea what was just outside his camp. He has no idea what he's going to do next, and he's incredibly ticked off because now, a week and a half worth of trapping sable has just gone to waste. But being the laid back kind of guy that he was, he figured, you know what, I'll just deal with this in the morning. And he tried to get to sleep. And the next morning, he got up, went as soon as it was light, made his way over to that chain system. And sure enough, the chain was completely gone. The pulleys were lying on the ground in pieces. And all the vegetation, all the branches of the trees leading away from camp were just completely flattened down. All the branches were shattered and broken. Joseph at this point's looking around for any sign of what could have done this. He's looking at the ground, looking for footprints, when all of a sudden he noticed that a lot of those broken branches were broken at a height of about 10 feet off the ground. This completely baffled him. He had no idea what could have done that. There was no animals that he was aware of that could reach that type of height. And at this point, he started asking himself, should I continue trapping? Should I get my traps and just leave? Count my losses for the year? And that's exactly what he decided to do. That morning, he just went out, gathered all of his traps, packed everything up, and then started making his way out of the mountains. He did not want to spend another night in that camp. So that first night on his hike out, he hiked all through the night. He took his chances hiking in the dark in this absolutely rugged terrain rather than spend another night in the camp. Well, that's it for today's encounters. My question for you is, what do you think was responsible for both these stories? I'd really love to know your thoughts on this, so please leave it in the comments below. If you haven't done so already, don't forget to gently slap that like button, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.